Welcome to this special edition of News 9. In this edition, we are going to speak to the celebrated author, Adrian Levy, who has penned a new book named Spy Stories with Kathy Scott Clark. The book offers a rare peep into the working of India's secret research and analysis wing and Pakistan's inter-service intelligence. Both of them have extensively written on the Taliban, Osama bin Laden, Mumbai attack, political Islam, and terrorism in the Indian subcontinent. Adrian, thank you very much for making time for this interview. And let me begin by asking you that what prompted you to write a book on ISI and RAW, and that too in a very unique format?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. It's terrific to be here, and it's a shame that with COVID the way it is, we're stuck in London and you're in India. I wish we were with you. So to your question, there were many reasons why we wanted to do this, and we spent many years trying to do it, probably the best part of a decade. The first reason is that some of the best books on the so-called American War on Terror period are books that have been written by Americans in which the Asian continent features as bit part players. And so a lot of the South Asian services, the security services in India, in Pakistan, and in other neighboring countries are portrayed as caricatures by in these American books. They're classically represented that way in movies and dramas as well, including Homeland, etc., etc. We can all name our favorites. And all of them seem to lack the grit or the knowledge or the depth to actually portray what goes on in the continent. It's a hot border. It's a tightly contested region. There has been a almost unstated or unwritten about, undocumented war that takes place covertly. And yet, why is it reduced to tropes and caricatures? Why is it that the American narrative is the dominant narrative, whereby it's led by CIA or led by FBI, etc.? And yet there are people here who have been slugging it out, who've been analysing, who've been deep in the weeds, who've been fighting. And yet their stories are not represented. So that was kind of the first thinking. And the actual trigger for it was an Israeli documentary called Gatekeepers. And if you've not seen it, I really recommend it. And in this film, Gatekeepers, an outstanding journalist and filmmaker called Dror Morer persuaded through stealth the heads of Shin Bet, which is the very, very secretive internal intelligence agency in Israel, to come on record. And once one did, two did, and once two did, four did. And before you knew it, you had Israel-Palestine described in a way that had never been described before by men who'd been at the sharp, secret end. We took copies of that film to everybody in South Asia. And to us, India, Pakistan, is every bit as kinetic, is for us, preeminent history. It's so vital that we understand what the strategic push and pull is in this tug of war. And so we took the movie, we took it to people who are very private and very secret, and we said, watch this film. A lot of what's going on now, the perhaps the most vicious and hotly contested part of the spy war is the war over influence. It's the war over truth, the war over perception. And we said, look at this movie in connection with the war on truth, perspectives, influence, and on narrative portrayal, and see if in there you can find something that chimes with you. And I've got to say that plan did not go very well, because no one wanted to appear on camera. And in fact, people did after that come forward to say they wanted to talk, but they were afraid of filming. And so we kept going back and we kept asking, and we were in Pakistan and we were in India and we were asking people. And eventually I think the idea, as this sort of truth wars became even more pronounced, the social media wars, the influencing wars, the wars over perception, particularly, post 2018, I think people, began to understand that, here is a platform, and better to be in on this platform than to be outside reading about it later. And so consequently, a small number of people got together and then a large number of people. But you may wonder why a foreigner got access. And I think that maybe being an outsider does help. Maybe having a global platform does help in the sense that, what is discussed can chime globally, and then maybe there's this feeling that the narrative that otherwise we would have presented can be altered and tweaked as pressures are placed on us, friendships are exerted on us. People are asking us, to look at this event, to focus on this group of people, to look at this group of analysts, and to go through and actually, help select the scenes. Because remember, this isn't exhaustive. It'd be a 300 volume set. If it was going to be 47 to 2021, that would be a 5 lifetimes work. And what these are cherry picked scenes from the intelligence battle between ISI and RAW, really from the 9/11 wars.
You have chosen to describe the agencies through the eyes of two agents, but experience is always subjective.
Well, first of all, the reason why we did that. So, as you know, we've interviewed the former heads of organisations, if not all of them, almost all of them. And we've also interviewed very senior executive officers in those organisations who have extraordinary intellect and extraordinary service. These are people with 30, 37 years of service. So other people kept saying to us, if you're truly going to represent the covert war, the spy wars, then what you need to do also is have people who are on the street corner, have people who are much lower down the pecking order, who see things from the fight, from the vantage point. So on the Pakistan side, we had a paramilitary officer, and on the Indian side, we had an analyst. And both of those saw things as they came across their desk. In the case of both people, there's a massive verification process. We've changed their names, we've guarded their identities, and as you can see behind me, there's stacks and stacks and stacks of files and books that relate to the period. And so we had a huge amount of cross-referencing to do. These books and files are not from these people, I should add, but it's a huge amount of documenting, checking, counter-checking, taking stories to other people. And there'll be a process of correction in this, because I'm sure already, as things appear or stories change, and that happened with the 2611 book, with the siege, we then update and we revise and, we push forward. With covert wars and with spy agencies, remember, spies lie. Part of the job is to be a pathological and convincing person. And so that, of course, became a pressing issue for us from the top down, from the senior executive officers to the paramilitary officers. Spies do lie.
Tell me one thing, you were meeting officers on both sides of the fence. Were you grilled regularly as to what the other side was thinking in the process of documentation and writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. Of course, every side wants the minutiae. If you're deep in the weeds and you're an analyst or you're a paramilitary officer, you're a clandestine officer, you want every single little tiny detail on your enemy. You want to build up a big picture. But, rather than being, let's say, an asset or, a source used by intelligence agencies or a back channel, we're not. It's an informal influence operation where people tell you things, you check them, other people ask questions. You also have to respect confidences. I mean, there's, many hours, 100 different people interviewed, hundreds of hours of discussions. And I've got to tell you that 90% of what's discussed has never made it into print. It may be too inflammatory. It was hard to chase down. There are truths that are told by ISI, some of which we were asked never to write. And some people at RAW asked us the same, and we respected that and didn't write them. And they're still here in our office.
You were constantly, when one goes through your book, you realize that you're constantly shuttling between cities. So you must have shuttled between Delhi and Islamabad. Did you ever feel that your project itself was becoming a channel of communication?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, I think, it's first of all, it is an influence operation in that all sides want to influence the way that this thing comes out. And also all sides want to share in certain informations. You'd be amazed. Obviously, there's huge curiosity because these channels are so infrequent, because there is no very, very rarely face-to-face meeting. And because there have only been, 3 clear episodes of back channels, each one at a time of crisis. It means that everyone is, massively curious and wants inevitably to tell you things. And some of those things may be messages that are conveyed. But that's good journalism, I think. The good journalism is to listen, not to talk, to get that information, then to place context on that information, to verify it and check it. And, to talk freely and not to lie and not to hide, to always say to people, I've been here. I was in Abhora. I'm in Delhi. You know, tell it like it is. Hide in plain sight. Do not resort to any backhandedness.
Now to the book. Now, what do you make of the Saudis and other Gulf states mediating between India and Pakistan on critical issues?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a very interesting development, and I'll tell you why. Because there have been other back channels that have almost succeeded between India and Pakistan and between ISI RAW. And these back channels have come at times of great fear. There's a very, very important back channel in 1988 and another one that almost came to fruition. And 1988, I should say, is a back channel that came about because of the fall of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, shades of what's going on now. In Afghanistan, and the second back channel that almost succeeded in 2006-7 is in the Musharraf period, and these had taken place with unstated intermediaries, other nations and individuals, including the King of Jordan, the royal Jordanian family, who got involved in those cases. Because the details are never really written about, it's unclear sometimes who the instigators and mediators are in these previous cases. So in the way that, let's say, the Jordanian royal family got involved in '88, and others got involved, also actually from Jordan and Egypt in the '90s. Likewise, now we have the involvement of Emiratis, Gulf states, and the Saudis. And it's interesting in particular because of two reasons. One, Saudis have been a benefactor slash mentor security partner with Pakistan, obviously, and second reason why it's interesting is because that relationship has been slipping, and other nations have been pushing Saudi, including Turkey, and Turkey's influence has been growing in Pakistan. And so I think Saudi's move was pivotal in placing itself back in the strategic dialogue, and it also reflects a huge success by Mr. Doval, Ajit Doval's team, the National Security Advisor, who have taken Muslim powers that previously have doubted or been indifferent towards India, and now these Muslim powers, Islamic powers, superpowers, are moving towards India and are interested in India and in India for many different reasons, economically, strategically, socially. And so, for example, Saudi now and the Emiratis are fascinated and needful and mindful of India through the work of Doval's team in a way that they hadn't been before. So natural, therefore, with concern about competition in Pakistan from China and Turkey, and with a need to woo India, the Saudis emerge. It's a fascinating piece of chess that's being played in an international level.
You know, you also seems to suggest in the book, especially in the context of attack on Mumbai and then Pulwama, that India and Pakistan are sometimes pawns in the game being played out by jihadis who want both the countries to go to war so that they can take advantage of the chaos. Please tell us more about that.
You've totally nailed it. I mean, I think the most surprising aspects when you listen to the people who author the reports is the way in which the jihad aspect is looking all the time at creating ungoverned spaces. How do these political right-wing, ultra-conservative armed groups rise, and how do they continue to dominate? They dominate in lawless spaces, or they're sponsored by nation states, as has happened in the past. And so when India and Pakistan draw together, when, for example, the Musharraf back channel almost succeeded, and that, of course, would have had massive ramifications for, security in India and Pakistan, then these groups attempt to destroy those deals. And they push the never-ending war button. And so you very much see 26/11 in that context, and Pulwama in that context, because yet again the nations are, through covert back channel, coming together. A huge pressure is on Pakistan through the FATF Financial Task Force, threat of sanctions, Pakistan driving talks with Taliban, with back channels for Afghanistan, and the never-ending war button is pressed again. And there's one other aspect to this, which I should point out, that while it's true that these calamitous, appalling terrorist attacks aim to bring regional war in order to enable the continued growth of jihad, there's another factor too, which is that large, significant sized sections of the Pakistan security forces, its intelligence agency, the military, and other groups of influence, including special forces, fell away from the Pakistani state as the American-Pakistan pact post 9/11 truly got into its pace. And these people who were specialists, who were former spies, soldiers, and most importantly, special forces, they mated with Al-Qaeda, they mated with Jaish-e-Mohammed, they mated with the sectarians of Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and Lashkar-e-Toiba, and they form a deadly amalgam. And so when you're looking at these groups, it's not simply that they are, let's say, the home guard, they're amateurs. They're not, they're war hardened, they're armed with weapons they stole, and they're led by a command and control structure which has never stopped fighting for 20, 25 years, which make it almost impossible to fight.
So now how does the return of the Taliban fit into this narrative?
Well, there's so many things. This is an entire conversation we should have on another day. One of the things that worries me, obviously, is the fact that chaos is ensuing. And this chaos by America's unplanned, chaotic withdrawal, this disaster, calamity that's taking place in Afghanistan right now, will lead to huge ungoverned spaces yet again in Afghanistan where groups will get together. We already know from the Pulwama evidence that, for example, Jaish-e-Mohammed melded with elements of Al-Qaeda, even parts of Pakistan Taliban and some of Islamic State, and they're all together now in different compounds moving around in southern Afghanistan. They're not in Pakistan. And so they're already taking advantage of the chaos and the anarchy in that area. And they will use that as a staging post. And inevitably our fear is, and everyone else's fear, is that that staging post will be used to attack, again, regionally. They've been present even wider geographically. They've been spotted in Turkey and in Syria, where they're getting arms training and explosives training, and inevitably this will feed back into the ungoverned space, the anarchy of Afghanistan. And a lot of this the blame lies with the US.
Before I ask questions on Pulwama, Pathankot or Balakot, you met Indian security officers at a very senior level. Do you get a different feeling of Indian security establishment under Doval? Do you feel that Indian security establishment and intelligence approach vis-a-vis Pakistan has changed under A.K. Doval? And if yes, in what ways?
It's a great question. The first thing to say is that and I'd just like to say this more generally, is that the Indian security establishment is not the one written about or portrayed in movies in India. It is not either, overtly clumsy, bureaucratic, cowardly, peacenik, tethered. These caricatures are all wrong. It's a service that has projected a cloak around itself. It has prevented reporting so that it can act in secrecy. And quite often, more often than not, it has acted in a ruthless and professional manner in the way that other intelligence services act. And yet we don't know, in a lot of instances, what it has done with these people. Under Ajit Doval, certainly there have been many, many changes. And a lot of those changes are to do with storytelling and narrative building, in the sense that there's massive outreach to influence people about what happens, and to influence the electorate in India about what happens, and to play a big role with social media. So I think psychological warfare, narrative building, definitely the case. And also in terms of the way events are projected. So for ordinary people, an event happens. We read about it, let's say it's a bomb attack, and we're horrified by it. And yet for an intelligence person, there'll be far more to this event. There'll be all sorts of pushes and pulls, the way the event is projected, and we may never get to the truth of that event. And Ajit Doval's team are very good at spinning the story of the event, placing it in their own context, pushing back against Pakistan. That definitely is one of the things. The second major thing, of course, more muscular in their approach, but also, one thing to bear in mind is that there are things that have happened and transformations that take place within the intelligence service, which have been happening for 20, 25, 30 years, 3 decades. And so it's wrong to see 2014 and, the BJP landslide as, the big trigger for these changes. These have been incremental changes in the organization, a reorganization of the organization. And the limitations are the same. The limitations have not been reduced. The negative factors have not been reduced. But we could say that it's more muscular, definitely, and that it's playing more games, and its psychological warfare is global, far more effective, and does by its nature continually put Pakistan in the frame when the data may reveal a more sophisticated and nuanced picture.
Tell me one thing, when you researched this book, what were the objectives behind Pathankot and Pulwama? Were they the same or completely different?
These are terrorist attacks. And in the case of Pulwama, the pictures were horrific. But are they useful? An intelligence operation has to be pragmatic. It has to look at events and leverage support with those events, leverage outrage. And what has happened under Mr. Deval, inevitably, is that it's leveraging these things for political outcomes. And it's doing so in tandem with the BJP government. So, of course, it fitted in with the electoral campaign. And we know that's the case as well from other documents that came to light and has subsequently been published and debated all over India. So there is this political component. The terrorism happened. It is real. Jaish Mohammed is real. Its network is real. My question would be something slightly different to that. Yes, there's political projection, but do we actually understand, in all this fog of war and the fog created by intelligence agencies, the real motivations and the real actors? So, for example, you mentioned Pathankot. A really interesting thing when you get down into the nitty-gritty is who's involved in Pathankot. First of all, Jaish is involved, of course, and it's the same dysfunctional family of Masood Azhar that's involved. Of course, we know that. Yet again, it has a command and control structure for both operations. That's in southern Afghanistan, hugely worrying for everyone in the anarchic space. But who else is involved? Global drug traffickers. They're involved because they have access to capital. They have access to Hawala systems to move money invisibly. And because that business dovetails with weapons trafficking, so they have access to explosives and weapons. So there's a narco element that fits into this too. And these are people who are based in the Gulf, who have connections through to the Punjab and to Kashmir. And that revolving network feeds in. And all of the nitty-gritty data also shows that the border itself is poorly protected. And so BSF didn't get the troops it needed, didn't get the manpower it needed. BSF didn't get the counterinsurgency technical assistance it needed, along that hot border. So there are many other factors that are present here. And remember that mostly these reports conclude that there's no institutional support by ISI. So this is not a case of whitewashing. But if you're going to project something afterwards, you're not going to play up what the enemy doesn't do. You're going to conjecture, you're going to create doubt, and you're yet going to go for the sectarian war, and you're going to say the chauvinist war, that it's ISI, it's Pakistan. The people who did the post-mortem in these events didn't find that to be the case.
Tell me one thing, can there ever be a spy swap when it comes to Jadhav, because you have dedicated a chapter on him?
Yeah,
what's the opinion on the Pakistan side, because you have really in great detail put that on record as to how he was caught and what happened subsequently?
He's collateral, isn't he? He's collateral. In my opinion, and from talking to all of these people on both sides, a tiny minnow was grown into a big whale. I've written this. And someone really small was projected. In a police operation, a man is in the wrong place. The cops catch him. The man may be charged, he may be tried. In an intelligence operation, a man can be in the wrong place, a woman can be in the wrong place, and that person will be watched, surveilled, and an opportunity will be assessed. Could this person be grown? Could he be manipulated, teased, and lured into a situation where he's bigger than he actually is? So in this sense, what those sources claim is that Yadav was grown into something, and he was projected as something. And then when the time came, unbeknownst to Yadav, he was captured and then shown in one light, in the way that he'd been grown. And this means that, the only thing that can happen is that he becomes collateral for a bridge of spies like Spy Exchange. Or, awfully, the same thing could happen negatively. I think everyone was fearful at a time that, if an execution or a hanging happens in India, a hanging may happen in Pakistan too. So there's a dreadful kind of equivalence, definitely, that underpins this. And remember that this is a family man as well as a man of service, a man with children and a wife in Mumbai. And so, let's have no doubt that a spy story is also a human story, a human tragedy.
Tell me, what's the difference between ISI and RAW, if you have to explain it to a common viewer, because, your book is about the two agencies, but you see there's a lot of public attention on Balakot, Pathankot, Pulwama, Jadhav, but the essence of the book is about these two agencies, post-colonial evolution. So what is the difference?
Well, I mean, there are lots of interesting differences. First of all, the thing, that's the most obvious, but also the most striking, is that obviously post-partition, an enormous number of capable Muslim officers left India. And they leave India, they leave IB, the Intelligence Bureau, and they leave the military, and they go to Pakistan. And so Pakistan develops with a smaller military and its own colonial-style intelligence bureau, and then subsequently its ISI. But the Muslim officers are missing, and so the nature of these organisations initially was dictated by them being police services, effectively, and also being divided right from an early stage along communal grounds, in the sense that neither organisation any longer reflected many different faiths and many different castes and creeds. And so that's something that would become exaggerated. The religiousness of organizations, their chauvinism becomes exaggerated over the decades. And so while, for example, Pakistan is always blamed through the Zia period and the Soviet-Afghan war period as being, indoctrinated by faith and chauvinism, everyone fears, political Islam in the ISI, political Islam in the military and civilian leadership when it comes. The same also happens to the security services as society changes in India. They become more chauvinist, they become more political, they become more sectarian and communal.
But
so, for example,
that's the word. Sorry, I'm interrupting you. That's the word I wanted to come at, because the Monisha, one of the characters, and Iftikhar, two principal characters. Monisha says that RAW has become sectarian. No minority representation. But how did you verify that?
This is a view that's been held by many people inside the Intelligence Bureau that we interviewed. Many people. I mean, more. I'd say between 9 and a dozen interviews reflected that, particularly during a period of intense scrutiny of the growing sectarianism and communal nature of security organisations. Look, the spy agencies and security services reflect the societies they're in. And as the societies become polarised, and as the societies become more communal, which has happened in India and in Pakistan, and more driven by faith and more driven by chauvinism, the security services do. And if, for example, RAW IB, if in the case of RAW, if it had a constitutional position, if it had a charter, if it had a clear, through a process of reform, position in society, then it couldn't be a political football. But you have a situation now where RAW IB are the producers, which is the term that Americans like to use for those people who create intelligence, and they're also the consumers. Now, outside India, the consumers are meant to be the legislature, they're meant to be the parliament, and yet in this sense they're not. So that's a danger. But similarities, let's talk about the similarities. Interestingly, both use proxy forces. That's an interesting similarity. Pakistan has done it brutally, and it's led to a lot of bloodshed in India and other places. But India has used proxy forces too. It's used them in Kashmir. It's used them in Andhra Pradesh, it's used them in the Punjab, and India also, as all intelligence agencies should, has recruited assets within organisations who've acted as proxies and assets and shutouts. It's worked incredibly effectively inside Pakistan with the MQM in Karachi, and it's used its offices in Vienna and Geneva and other places to do that. So it's, both organisations have kinetic, hot operations. If bad people are needed by intelligence agencies to penetrate bad, illegal worlds, you need thieves to catch thieves and terrorists to catch terrorists, and both outfits are recruiting those or attempting to all the time.
And last question, a very quick reply. During your research, did you hit upon the word Pegasus?
Yes. Yeah, there's a really amazing history really explains how we got there, and that history, which is a thread pulled through the book, begins in 2004 with the coming together under Condoleezza Rice of a new kind of envisioning of India by America. It took a while for that to heat up, and you have two things that come together. India has developed already a great ability at technical intelligence, and you'll remember that hugely important episode which we all watched and were stunned by when Indian intelligence eavesdropped on Musharraf's conversation with an army chief. And it led to the exposure of the lie in Pakistan that Kashmir freedom fighters were in the Kargil Heights when they were regular soldiers. That intercepting capability developed. It was shored up through political pacts that came about in 2004, a deepening relationship with Israel, which came about after the Mumbai attack, the attack on the Jewish Center, 26/11, and the wakening up of that, and then a coming together of intelligence agencies sows the ground. And before that, you see NSA, the American NSA, and British GCHQ coming together to back different initiatives and mentoring within RAW. And then, you have early programs like FinFisher. You may remember FinFisher. FinFisher was a program that India bought into, and that could crack Blackberries and early Android devices, but wasn't so successful with iPhones. And then from that, was extrapolated the NSO software, and that operation actually began in 2018. And 2018 moving into 2019, the Pegasus thing was trialed and then actually initiated in 2019. And so actually there's a long history prior to this scandal with the leak that was publicized around the world. And it's one that you could, we could draw a line from Kargil to Pegasus and see the evolution of those ideas.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you so much for joining us from London. Thank you so much. And
it's a great
reading
pleasure.
your book has been a pleasure.
Thanks very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
So this is all in this special edition of News 9. For more news and more updates on current affairs, keep on watching TV9 Digital.